Hello, friends. Tonight, it gets weird. We meet Clyde. He is a hippie, a philosopher, author, world explorer, and slayer of gnomes, which are some of the evilest creatures to ever prey upon us humans. More people need to know Clyde's story, in the hopes that they will be inspired by his willingness to sacrifice his hopes and dreams to stand up to evil. I am Lafayette Faust, and I promise that this is a story like no other. So, I invite you to sit back, turn on a light, and prepare yourself. Clyde Tolan had been many things in his 70 years of life. Poet, professor, shaman to a tribe of albino pygmies in South America, and a carny, just to name a few. Most recently, he was the full-time custodian at Nevermore's only nut house, Morning Star Sanitarium. He had experienced a normal childhood, but in 1970, at the age of 16, life presented him with a choice between two roads. One led to a normal life, with a career and a family. The other would be dark and winding, and would lead him to treacherous and bizarre destinations. He had stood at that crossroads, not quite a man, but no longer a boy, and had chosen the dark road. And as he had expected of that fateful choice, he had led a life of perilous adventure that had often required him to take on those incongruous roles to accomplish what he had come to believe was his destiny. Clyde Tolan was a slayer of gnomes. He'd learned quickly, back in the early days of leaning into his calling, that normal people were not willing to accept the reality that gnomes existed. And they were especially not willing to accept the idea that gnomes were not the cute little men with sleepy eyes and benign smiles and pointy hats. Whenever he would describe the true and disturbing physiology of a gnome, they would look at him as if he had lost his mind on a back road somewhere while tripping on some bad acid. Because of this, he had come to understand that his destiny of hunting and killing these nasty little bastards would require a lonely life. He had no friends. He was always on the hunt, which had taken him around the world numerous times. And beyond that spring of 1970, he had not allowed himself to have a romantic relationship. He often felt that he would die alone while traveling the world on his endless hunt. That is, until he landed in Nevermore Hollows. 6 months ago, he had tracked a group of gnomes from Florida to their lair deep in Dunwich Forest, which surrounded Nevermore Hollows. After wiping out their lair, he decided to stay for a while. Within a couple of days, he had seen enough to realize that Nevermore was a nexus of the paranormal and the strange, and he'd decided to spend the remainder of his life here, so that he could study the myriad paranormal beings that lurked in the darkness that touched this town. He also wanted to get to know Barbara Mundy a little better. Once he'd made the decision to stay in Nevermore Hollows, he landed a full-time janitor gig at Morning Star Sanitarium, Nevermore's only hospital for the insane. Barbara Mundy, one of the graveyard shift nurses, had made a point to get to know his life story. After a while, he relented and told her the truth. And instead of believing he was a burnt-out hippie nutcase with the delusion that he was a janitor/gnome slayer, she had shown him that she had a flexible mind. "I've lived in Nevermore Hollows a long time," she had said. "There are things here that humans would find unexplainable." Barbara was the closest he had come since the summer of 1970 to having a romantic partner. Barbara made it clear she was willing to be more than a friend. She often told him how much she liked his long gray ponytail and his small round glasses. She would say, I love your retro style, Clyde. You are a man who knows exactly who he is, which is so unlike younger men today. Clyde would feel awkward at her compliments, in part because he was so self-conscious that he was a 70-year-old man, though extremely fit for his age, and she seemed to be only a few days past 40. He had on more than one occasion considered letting his guard down enough to see where the relationship would lead. But their budding romance ended a little over an hour ago at 11:45 p.m. when Billy Goins, one of the patients, had become convinced she was a vampire and had staked her in the heart. Billy had confided his theory about Barbara being one of the undead to his sister Janine, who should probably have been a patient herself, considering she thought she was the reincarnation of Cleopatra. Trusting in her brother's ability to accurately identify vampires, she had snuck in a set of chopsticks she had gotten from the Happy Kaiju Chinese restaurant, which he then used to stab Barbara in the heart. Billy's murderous intent would never be made public. The director of the sanitarium, Dr. Sledgeboom, moved to make sure all evidence of Billy's attack was destroyed, but not before Clyde was able to have a look. Being the only live-in janitor at the sanitarium, Clyde got to see the putrid truth behind the glimmering facade that Sledgeboom chose to show the public. Sledgeboom was an arrogant man who ran the sanitarium as if he were a power-mad king. Most of the patients suffered under his rule, but for some strange reason, Sledgeboom trusted Clyde. So, after Billy had stabbed Barbara in the heart, he had called for Clyde to clean up the mess in Billy's room. Clyde pushed his mop bucket into the room while Sledgeboom and an orderly were strapping Billy into a straitjacket. Billy's eyes were wild, and he was grinning. "I didn't kill her," Billy said. I stabbed her good, right in the heart. With my chopsticks, I plunged them deep, but she didn't go down. No, sir, she did not. She just growled at me and shoved me across the room like I was a rag doll. Then she turned into a purple mist and went up through the vent. You have to believe me." Sledgeboom turned to Clyde and said, "Clean that up and take that uniform to my office. Make sure no one sees the uniform. Am I clear?" Clyde nodded that he understood and looked at the mess to which Sledgeboom had pointed. Barbara's white uniform lay in a crumpled heap on the floor next to her white shoes and nurse's cap. The uniform was stained with a sticky black substance. That same gooey substance had pooled on the floor and had the same consistency as blood. It took a moment for Clyde to realize the uniform was Barbara's. Then it hit him hard. The hope of romance had been resurrected in his heart after meeting Barbara, but now that hope was slain and forever dead. He forced the pain into the dark pit of his lonely soul and set about cleaning up the mess. When he was done, he put the uniform in a black garbage bag, then left the room while Sledgeboom and the orderly administered a sedative to Billy. He used his master key to let himself into the director's office and set the garbage bag with Barbara's uniform on top of the desk. He stood in the dark office and pulled out his phone. He had secretly installed tiny security cameras throughout the sanitarium. It had been easy to do, considering he was the janitor. He even had some hidden in the ceiling air vents in a few of the patients' rooms, one of which was Billy's. He pulled up an app on his phone and clicked on the feed for Billy's room, then rewound to the point where Barbara stepped inside with his midnight medications. Billy was hiding behind the door, chopsticks at the ready, and when she entered, he stepped in front of her, causing her to jump back in surprise. Billy was lightning quick and rammed the chopsticks deep into Barbara's chest. Billy was telling the truth. Barbara grimaced in rage, snatched him up, and threw him across the room as if he were an unwanted voodoo doll. She then pulled the chopsticks from her chest and threw them onto the floor. They rattled like tiny bones as they rolled under Billy's bed. Then She flicked her wrist and dematerialized into a luminescent purple mist which twirled up into the vent, leaving behind her uniform and the pool of black goo. Damn. I really liked her. This really hurts. Then he wondered that if Barbara was a vampire, why the chopsticks to the heart did not kill her. He rewound the video and watched the altercation at a slower speed. Ah, he thought. Billy missed her heart. If the lore is correct and vampires can be killed by a stake to the heart, then she survived because he missed. But I don't really know anything about vampires. Maybe chopsticks are not made of the right kind of wood, or she might be some other kind of paranormal creature. Shrugging off the sting that the woman he'd considered romancing was some form of undead freak, he shut off the app and left Sledgeboom's office. He made his way back to Billy's room, intending to retrieve the chopsticks. As he walked, he considered this new information about Barbara and reflected on the path he'd taken, which had led him to Morning Star Sanitarium. Decades ago, in the golden-hued year of 1970, Clyde had fallen hard for a blonde-haired goddess named Birdsong Daffodil. Her real name was Jane Johansson, but she was so immersed in the hippie movement that she had chosen a new, earth-loving name for herself. Back then, he had been attending the University of Tennessee, pursuing a degree in anthropology, and was walking across campus when he happened upon a sit-in that her commune was staging against the Vietnam War. Being an anthropology nerd, he was fascinated in the various societal cultures, so when he walked past the sit-in, he decided to ask a couple of the hippies a few questions about their movement. He'd quickly become frustrated. The first two teenage girls had just shared a bong and could only tell him how groovy they felt. He then tried to speak to a young man named Freedom who was in the middle of a very bad LSD trip. He simply replied by hysterically crying, a long strand of snot hanging from his nose, repeating over and over that the wind had whispered the secret of the world in his ear, and that the secret was death. Just when Clyde had come to think that the hippie movement was full of dope fiends, Birdsong Daffodil walked up and introduced herself. One look and he was drunk on her smile, and he took a heady trip into her cornflower blue eyes. When she spoke, the notes of her voice resonated with him in such a way he felt in complete tune with the world around him. He spent the next 6 weeks by her side. Later, he would often be surprised at how quickly he had allowed himself to be immersed into the hippie culture. His hair had already begun to be longish, but he grew a ponytail, moved in with her commune located in the Smoky Mountains, and began expanding his mind with marijuana. He had come to see the world as a beautiful garden that had become corrupted with sovereign boundaries, corporate greed, and political agendas. He became convinced that the only way to get the world back to its state of original beauty and out from under the boot heel of the man was to expand everyone's mind with love and music and serenity and weed. They got married that July in a daisy-sprinkled glade, surrounded by their earth-loving, war-hating, counterculture friends. That night, in that same glade, they sat mesmerized by the sparks from a bonfire, smoking the earth's gift, when one of them, a young man named Rainbow Bear, suggested they drop some shrooms. Up to this point, no one in their commune had taken any hallucinogenic mushrooms. Birdsong turned to him, the flickering of the flames warming him along with the heat of her smile, and said, "I've never done shrooms. Let's drop some shrooms and make love." Clyde, up to this point, had only allowed himself to partake in weed, because being a true lover of all things earthy and natural, he didn't want any drug in his body created in a lab somewhere, especially LSD, since there were rumors that it was created in a secret CIA lab and was being used as a tool to control the minds of the youth. But magic mushrooms grew from the earth, therefore, by his hippie reasoning, could only be good. Besides, Clyde was always down to clown when it came to making love to Birdsong. "Let's do it," he replied, noting the sparks in her eyes were more mesmerizing than the sparks from the fire. There were 20 of them in their commune, and Rainbow Bear dropped a shroom in each one of their eager hands. Clyde looked at the dried morsel, noting it looked ancient, mummified. A sudden fear crept into the pit of his stomach and crawled into his marrow, turning his blood cold. We shouldn't do this, he thought. Nothing good will come of it. He looked at his bride and saw the shine of curiosity on her face. If she were going to trip on the shroom, he would take the trip with her. But the notion of imminent danger nagged at him. I'm not sure I want a long trip, he said. Let's just take half. She shrugged and said, okay. He broke his mushroom in half and plopped the withered morsel into his mouth and chewed. She took the other half from him and put it into her mouth. It took about 15 minutes for him and his commune family to feel the effects. Janine Kirk, now known as Jade Flower, was the first to scream. Clyde's mind had disentangled itself from his body. It seemed to hover 10 feet or so above the group. He watched as his body jerked in reaction to Jade's scream. He saw the others turn their dope-wet eyes toward her, confusion all on their faces. Jade pushed herself up. Her voice trembled on the ledge of hysteria. What is that? She gasped, pointing toward the dark tree line. Clyde's consciousness looked down to where Jade had pointed. At first, he could not see what had scared her because he was so distracted by the ethereal auras around the heads of his hippie brothers and sisters. These auras shimmered in vibrant blue, green, and purple. He forced himself to look beyond the auras and focus on the spot at the edge of the woods that caused Jade such panic. After a moment, his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and that's when he saw it. His mind stumbled on its rainbow-colored trip when a tiny man stepped into the circle of light cast by the bonfire. His mind fell hard back into his body, causing him to reel back and nearly fall off the log on which he was sitting. He rubbed his eyes and took another look, and for 3 long heartbeats he struggled to understand what he was seeing. The man was maybe 2 feet high, had a flowing beard with a pointy hat sitting atop his head. He remembered seeing pictures in storybooks from when he was a kid about elves and fairies and such, and knew that what stood before them was a gnome. The others in the group all turned their attention to the little man. One of the girls said, "How cute!" One of the guys said, "Far out, man." Another said, "That dude looks just like a gnome." "What? No!" Jade screamed. "It's not a gnome. Don't you see? It's hideous. Throw something at it. Get it away from here. Kill it." "Jade be trippin' hard," Lou Jenkins said. He went by his given name, telling everyone that Mother Earth had yet to reveal to him his hippie name. "That's just a tiny old man." Lou turned to the tiny man and said, "Come on over, little dude. Have a seat." Jade shot up and grabbed one of the sharpened sticks that they had used earlier to roast marshmallows. "No! Stop!" She pointed the stick at the little man. "Get away! Shoo! Don't come any closer!" The tiny man stepped further into the light. As he did, Birdsong gasped. Clyde looked at her and saw that her trippy glee had morphed into open-mouth horror. "What is it, babe?" he slurred. She turned to him, clutched at his shirt with violently shaking hands. "I see what she sees," she whispered. "It's a demon." Clyde looked over at the tiny man, trying to force his mind to focus and not be so distracted by the slowly swirling auras and a strange, comforting melody that had sprung up inside his mind. He could only see the tiny man in a pointy hat with a beard. But as he focused his mind beyond the haze, the little man shimmered, as if he were surrounded by a hologram. Clyde caught a glimpse of rows of pointed teeth behind the shimmer. He rubbed his eyes and took another look. The shimmer had dissipated, and only a tiny man stood before them. but the glimpse of that something else gave him a deep unsettling. He grabbed Birdsong's trembling hands. "Take me away from here," she whispered. She was shivering as if she were chilled to her core. "It's going to eat us, and then it'll drag us to hell." Clyde's heart was beating fast and hard. He squinted, forcing the effects of the drug to the side. As he did, the shimmer around the little man returned, and then suddenly melted away, revealing the truth of what stood before them. "Oh, great God in heaven, save us," he thought, suddenly completely sober, heart hammering. The thing that stood before them was naked and hairless. It had an elongated skull ending in a rounded point. It had tiny red eyes that flared in the firelight. Its small mouth seemed to contain 100 gleaming needles of teeth. From its chin hung not a beard, but 4 thick tentacles that writhed like intertwining snakes. The thing took a step closer into the ring of campfire light. Jade screamed and backed further away, pointing her stick directly at the little beast. Lou stood and gave Jade an angry look. "Don't scare the little guy away," he said. "He looks friendly." He leaned over and put his hands on his knees, looking down at the tiny monster. "Welcome. We mean you no harm. Jade's just tripping a little too much." The tiny beast took a step toward Lou. Jade said, "Lou, I haven't taken any drugs tonight. I'm not tripping." Clyde realized that when he had been feeling the effects of the mushrooms, she had been the only one without an aura around her head. A thought struck him. What does that mean? Lou glanced over at her, confusion on his bleary face. "What?" he said. But before Jade could explain further, the thing leaped forward, grabbed Lou's head with its small 4-fingered hands, and sunk its teeth deep into his forehead. Lou laughed as if he were playing with a cuddly puppy. Blood sprayed, bone crunched. The creature used its needle-like teeth to chew a hole into Lou's forehead. It then stuck its fingers into that hole and broke off a chunk of Lou's skull. Clyde was sober, but his eyes still picked up the luminescent aura that surrounded Lou. He could see that the aura pulsed brighter inside the exposed portion of his brain. The creature leaned over and inhaled, pulling the pulsating colors into its mouth. The creature jumped off Lou's face and scampered, monkey-like, and onto Rainbow Bear's back. It chomped down onto his skull, then used its hands to break the bone, exposing another glowing portion of brain. It inhaled the aura. Rainbow Bear had his eyes closed and a peaceful smile on his lips. Everyone was smiling, giggling, pointing. Everyone but Jade and Birdsong and Clyde laughed at the carnage as if they were witnessing a cute and playful moment play out before them. Jade glanced over at Clyde and Birdsong, wild-eyed with terror. Why are they laughing?" Clyde jumped up, grabbed another one of the sharpened sticks as the creature sucked the luminescent aura from Rainbow Bear's brain. "Whoa, man," Johnny Ryan said. He was the newest member of the commune and decided not to choose a hippie name. "Tone down the violence, dude. You're harshing everyone's vibe." Birdsong looked at Johnny with confusion on her face. "That thing is eating Rainbow Bear." Johnny looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "You need to come back down to earth, sister. You're way too high. That little guy is just playing with us." The creature finished sucking the aura from Rainbow's brain. It scampered monkey quick at Jade. Clyde charged and stabbed the stick into the creature's torso before it could jump onto her. It squealed and grabbed the stick, trying to wrench it from its body, but Clyde pushed harder, running the stick completely through and pinning the creature to the ground. He watched as it thrashed in its death throes. His heart hammered, his breath ragged. He felt victorious. Then, Birdsong let out a scream that ended in a ragged garble. He turned to see another one of the creatures as it chewed on his bride's head. He watched in stunned horror as it ripped a portion of her skull and exposed her brain, which glowed much more faintly than Lou's or Rainbow Bear's. He saw the sparkle in her eyes, which often reminded him of tiny fireflies, flutter and dim, and then her body dropped to the ground. The creature turned and glared at him with its gleaming red eyes, and he was filled with an all-consuming rage. He lifted his stick and charged at the creature. Just as he was about to stab the blood-spattered beast, a shot rang out and echoed through the forest. The thing exploded in a chunky mist. More shots rang out as Clyde turned to see who was shooting. 2 more of the creatures had run out of the woods and had quickly killed every one of his hippie brothers and sisters. The creatures had been shot and lay in tiny bloody heaps. Clyde's mind reeled as he took in the carnage. The bodies of his friends lay everywhere, the tops of their skulls torn away. He caught movement to his right and turned to see an old man wearing overalls and a ratty cowboy hat step into the ring of campfire light. "You okay?" the man asked. Clyde realized he was shaking his head and crying. "No, I'm not." He looked down at Birdsong, wanting her to live, praying he was in the midst of a bad trip, but knowing that he was not. He wanted to remember her radiant beauty, but knew full well that for the rest of his life he would always remember her here, lying on the blood-stained grass, a chunk of her skull missing, her eyes empty of fireflies, and staring up into the black sky. "I'll never be okay again." The man glanced around. "These little bastards run in groups of 4, but these woods are full of them. There's likely to be more. We need to get moving." Clyde pulled his eyes from his dead wife's body and looked at the man. "Who are you? What are those things?" The old man's eyes were soft with sympathy, as if he too had experienced tragic loss at the hands of these evil little beasts. "Name's Walter Creek, and those were gnomes." Clyde forced his grief deep down so that he could focus and try to understand. "When the first one showed up, that's what I saw. It looked just like the gnomes in fairy tales, but they changed. Jade, Birdsong, and we saw the truth, but the others didn't." His voice cracked when he said his wife's name, mirroring his soul. Walter stepped closer and used the toe of his boot to kick the one that Clyde had impaled into the ground. "Yeah, that's how they present themselves. It allows them to get close enough to feed. The 3 of you saw the truth because you didn't take enough of the magic mushrooms." "I don't understand," said Clyde. "I'll explain," Walter said. "But first, let's get out of here." We can't leave them here," Clyde said. His heart dissolved into a pit of acidic angst at the idea of leaving Birdsong's body behind. Walter placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You have to. This place will be overrun by these little shits before long. Let's go to my truck. I'll explain everything." Clyde allowed himself to be led back to an old logging road where a mud-covered Ford was parked. They got inside and locked the doors. Walter said, "These things have been around since time began. They feed off of a chemical that's released when humans take psilocybin." "Psilocybin?" Clyde asked. Walter frowned at him. "Yes. Psilocybin is what's in the magic mushrooms y'all took that made you high. When we humans get high on psilocybin, our brains secrete a chemical. Gnomes feed off that chemical." Clyde considered this information. "Jade didn't take any of the mushrooms, and Birdsong and I only took half. That's what you meant earlier, right? We didn't have enough of the psilocybin in us to be tricked. That's right, Walter said as he buckled himself in. How did they trick us like that? Clyde said. How did they make themselves look like the gnomes in storybooks? Walter scratched at the gray scruff on his face. Gnomes are also magical creatures. They use that magic to present themselves as cute and friendly little men. That's how they get close enough to feed. Get it? Clyde felt himself nod. I think so. Wait. Magic is real? Walter put the truck in gear and began to drive. Magic is real. Monsters are real. Both are evil. They drove in silence. The only light was the ephemeral green glow of the dashboard lights. When Walter turned off the logging road and onto a narrow paved road that led down the mountain, he said, I know you're in shock. But now that you know this dark truth about the world, your life is forever changed. Clyde heard himself mumble something incoherent. There's no use in reporting what happened tonight. The gnomes will have carried off the bodies by morning. The authorities will chalk it up to your hippie friends running off to start a commune or a cult somewhere. Now, you can handle this information about the spiritual realm in one of two ways. You can try to ignore it, push it down, and try to live a normal life, or you can choose to learn all you can about it and fight. Fight? Clyde mumbled. Why would I fight? Well, Walter said, I'm speaking from experience here, son. Evil is always in the fight. Look at it this way. Most people wonder why terrible things happen, like, things like murder, rape, war, and worse. It's because something evil from the spiritual realm is at work. But modern man has allowed himself to be so conditioned to believe only in the rational, the scientific, that the mere idea of a spiritual realm seems silly. But then they struggle to use reason and science to explain these dark deeds. It's a collective willful ignorance. Anyway, I can't tell you how to live your life, son, but I suggest you don't ignore the truth that's been revealed to you tonight. Clyde looked over at Walter and wiped his eyes dry. I feel like I just went crazy. Walter turned and held his gaze for a long heartbeat. No, son. Tonight, you went sane. Walter drove Clyde all the way back to Knoxville, gave him his phone number, and dropped him off at his apartment located just off campus. Clyde spent the next 3 days mourning Birdsong and trying to come to terms with the concept of magic and monsters and evil incarnate. On the 4th day, he called the number that Walter had given him and asked that Walter teach him all he knew about gnomes and how to kill them. A few days later, during one of their conversations, as Walter taught him how to handle a shotgun, Clyde realized that he had seen a drawing in an old anthropology book that looked remarkably like the gnome's true form. Well, I know they've been around forever, Walter said, but I've never found any drawings or pictures. Everything I've discovered has been by reading between the lines of folklore and fairy tales and through personal experience. They drove to the university library and found the book. See? Clyde said, pointing to a stone carving on the wall of a Mayan pyramid. It is exactly the same thing as what killed my friends. These Mayans held these creatures in great esteem, even wrapping the heads of their babies so that their skulls would fuse in this elongated fashion. Walter nodded as he looked at the picture. I'll be damned. I think you're on to something. Clyde spent the rest of that summer learning all he could about how to defend himself with various martial arts and all manner of weapons. Then, equipped with the truth that evil was a real force that manifested itself in myriad ways to lie, cheat, steal, and kill humanity, he stood at the proverbial crossroads. He could attempt a normal life, or he could go into the world and hunt down these gnomes and kill as many as he could, with the hopes that he would spare some poor sap the heartache that he experienced at losing his bird song. He had chosen to fight, and it was a path that had led him to South America and beyond as he became what he was sure was the world's foremost authority on gnomes and how to kill them. He had become Clyde, the Slayer of Gnomes. He reflected on all these events of his life as he walked across the sanitarium, ultimately turning onto the wing where Billy's room was located. He had to get his hands on the chopsticks before Billy found them and tried to kill anyone else. Besides, he had decided he wanted a sample of the black blood that came out of that Barbara thing, and the chopsticks would surely be covered in the stuff. He glanced at his watch and noted that it was nearing 1 a.m., and he hoped that Billy would be asleep due to the meds Sledgeboom had injected him with. There were 20 rooms on this wing, 10 on each side of the hallway. Billy was in room 111 and was the 6th door on the right. As he walked by room 105, he heard Harold Gardner, the patient who resided in that room, say, "Wow, man, I can touch the colors. They're so luminescent." Clyde stopped cold. People suffering the effects of psilocybin often saw and felt they could touch vibrant, swirling colors. He had once heard someone refer to this as walking the Rainbow Road. He walked over and peeked through the small window into Harold's room. The man was sitting up in his bed, his back against the headboard, eyes glazed as he walked the Rainbow Road. He had a slight smile, and his hands were up, fingers working in the air as he hallucinated that he was touching the glowing colors in his mind. "Crap," Clyde thought. "He's been slipped some shrooms." Then, a more disturbing thought hit him. Harold was already a patient when I got here 6 months ago. He had suffered a nervous breakdown after his wife left him, and he had not shown any sign of hallucinations since I've been here. If he's tripping, how did he get slipped the psilocybin? It can't be in the food or the water we serve. I secretly test that every day to make sure nothing from the outside gets in. There were only 2 possibilities. Someone who works here slipped it to him, or there's a gnome running loose in the asylum. His bet was on the gnome. He had to take care of the chopsticks first. He hustled down to Billy's room, used his master key to let himself in. Billy sat in the corner, rocking back and forth, mumbling, "I can fly. I'm one with all space and time, and it is so beautiful. I never experienced anything like this." He glanced up at Clyde, his pupils so wide they looked like tiny wormholes leading into new dimensions. I think I'm having an out-of-body experience." "Shit," Clyde said, realizing 2 things. The first was that the drug Sledgeboom had given him must not have caused him to sleep. The second was that Billy had somehow been given magic mushrooms. "You're going to be all right, Billy. I promise." Then he got down on his knees and looked under Billy's bed. The chopsticks were there, and they were surprisingly clean, with only a couple small smears of black goo. He grabbed them, careful not to get any of the black stuff on his hands, and put them in a zip-style sandwich bag. "It might get pretty scary before this is over," he said, "but I promise I'm going to do all I can to protect you." He let himself out into the hallway and locked the door behind him. From across the hall in room 110, he heard Sarah Reese say, "Is that a unicorn?" Damn it. If she's seeing unicorns, that means she's also having full-on hallucinations, which means they're getting heavy doses. This is going to cause a feeding frenzy. With that thought, Clyde's blood ran cold. There's more than one gnome here. They hunt in packs of 4, so there's at least that many. There's no way to miss them. How are they getting in? Where are they hiding? He snuck over to Sarah's door and peeked through the window. She was sitting in the center of the room, legs crossed, staring up, her eyes wide with wonder, a dreamy smile on her face. He looked up and saw the HVAC vent in the ceiling. That's how those little bastards are getting in. He watched as a mushroom was pushed through the vent and landed on the floor next to Sarah. She picked it up, said, "Oh, another piece of candy," and plopped it in her mouth. So, that's how the patients are getting the mushrooms. But why would someone eat a mushroom dropped from an air vent? Then, Clyde realized he was in a sanitarium filled with crazy people. One of the two screws holding the vent cover in place began to slowly turn, emitting a tiny squeaking, as if one of the gnomes twisted it loose from inside the vent. The screw fell from the vent onto the floor. Sarah giggled and patted her hands together in eager anticipation. Clyde usually pushed around a cart with various cleaning supplies and some tools with which he could conduct his work. In a secret compartment in that cart, he also kept a shotgun, a pistol, and a couple of knives. When Sledgeboom called him to clean up the mess in Billy's room, he'd only brought the mop and bucket. He'd left his cart back in the office. I have absolutely no weapon to use to fight these bastards. The second screw was halfway out of the cover. He had to decide how to proceed. He shot a glance down the hall and saw only a fire extinguisher. It was too far away. By the time he grabbed it, the gnome would be out of the vent and tearing into Sarah's skull. He looked down at the Ziploc bag he held in his hand. The chopsticks were his only possible weapon. "Shit," he said. He removed the chopsticks from the bag and used his master key to unlock the door. Chopsticks it is. The door swung open just as the vent cover dropped to the floor. Clyde gripped a chopstick in each hand. One pointed up so he could jab, the other pointed down so he could stab. There was a long moment where nothing happened. He and Sarah stared into the dark rectangular hole in the ceiling, she with a look of gooey-eyed amazement, he with a steely-eyed readiness for slaying. Then the gnome dropped out of the vent and onto the floor. It stood naked and hairless, its beady red eyes locked onto Clyde, its fingers flicking in anticipation. The 4 short tentacles dangling from its chin writhed like hungry snakes. Then it opened its mouth and hissed. Over the years, thousands of these nasty little beasts had hissed at him. It sounded like a mix of cat and snake and always chilled his blood. It looked at Sarah and sniffed. Clyde knew that it was sniffing the chemicals released from her brain due to the effects of the psilocybin. It then turned its eyes back on him. It clearly wanted to feed, but was wary of him. "What a sweet little kitty," cooed Sarah. "Come give Mommy a snuggles." So that's new, Clyde thought. She sees it as a cat and not as a storybook gnome. But again, the realization that he was in a sanitarium reminded him that this was not necessarily a new ability that the gnomes had developed. But he decided to file it away for future consideration, just in case. The gnome looked again at Sarah as hungry drool bled from its mouth and down its chin. Then, in a blur, the gnome attacked. It leaped over Sarah and sprang into the air, claws out, its mouth full of needle-sharp teeth opened wide. Clyde stood his ground and thrust one chopstick into the gnome's belly while it was still in midair. It hissed in pain and sunk its pointy fingers into his forearm, causing him to gasp in pain. The momentum of the gnome's attack knocked Clyde backward. He fell against the door, the gnome gripping his arm and snapping its needle teeth at his throat. Clyde stabbed the second chopstick into the gnome's right eye. It gave a ragged hiss and went limp. Clyde dropped the gnome to the floor and pulled the chopsticks free from its lifeless body. Sarah clapped her hands with glee. "Wow, what a playful little kitty! Can I pet it?" "I wouldn't," Clyde said. He reached down, grabbed the gnome, and tossed it into the hall and out of her reach. "It's rabid." "Oh, dear," Sarah said, pouting her disappointment. He heard the telltale sound of a screw hitting the floor in the room behind him. It made sense that the gnomes, however many there were, would split up and not attempt to have more than one per room. There were over 100 patients living in the sanitarium, therefore more than enough potential victims. So, hoping this assessment was correct and Sarah would be safe, he slammed her door shut behind him as he ran across the hallway to Billy's room. As he fumbled for his key to open the door, he heard the vent cover slam to the floor. Then, Billy screamed. Clyde looked through the window and saw a gnome chomping on his forehead. The gnome pulled back and spat a chunk of skull into the corner and began chewing on his brain. Clyde saw the gnome shudder in ecstasy. Damn. There's nothing I can do. So he chose to not open the door. Billy was gone. There were others he could save. He ran to Harold's room and glanced through the window. He watched as the first screw in the vent fell to the floor. Harold sat on the edge of his bed, a hand up in the air, going through the motions as if he were petting something. Clyde unlocked the door and stepped inside. He prepared himself for another attack, wishing he had more than just a couple chopsticks. "Where did you come from, Mr. Rabbit?" Harold said, stroking the air. "Your fur is so soft." He turned to Clyde and said, "Do you see this guy? He's a rabbit. But he wears a hat and a watch, and he speaks perfect English." The second screw popped out and fell to the floor. A heartbeat later, the vent cover was knocked loose, and another gnome plopped out and fell onto the floor. This gnome had a jagged scar slashed across its face. It didn't even glance at Clyde. Its eyes closed, it sniffed the air, then it charged at Harold. Clyde stepped forward and kicked the gnome, sending it across the room onto the bed. He rushed the gnome, chopsticks at the ready. The gnome was cat-quick as it rolled up onto its feet and jumped back onto the floor and scrambled at Harold. Clyde swung a chopstick down into its back. It growled and hissed and spat and tried to roll. Clyde jabbed the second chopstick through the tiny hole that served as one of its ears, deep into its brain. It stopped struggling and went limp. "Aw, man," Harold said, eyes wide in dreamy shock. "You just murdered that little man." "You're just having a really weird dream," Clyde said, and tossed the dead gnome into the hallway. He ran across the hallway and looked inside room 109, but was too late. Margaret Franks, a middle-aged woman with wild red hair, giggled as a gnome scraped its teeth against her forehead. "That tickles," she said. Clyde knew he couldn't save her, so he ran to another room and another and yet another, checking for gnomes. He saw no other signs of any in any of the other rooms. Good, he thought. I've killed 2, the ones attacking Harold and Sarah, so that leaves 2, which are the ones in Margaret's and Billy's rooms. He ran to Billy's room, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Billy's body lay on the floor. The gnome sat on his chest, chewing at his head. It raised its gore-covered face from Billy's forehead, and its lips pulled back into a razor-toothed grimace. Then it hissed a warning. "You nasty little bastard," Clyde said. "I'm ready for you. Come on." The gnome leaned down and licked the open wound on Billy's head. All the while its eyes were focused on Clyde, a clear challenge to stay away from its meal. Clyde heard someone enter through the door at the far end of the hallway. "What the hell is going on here?" It was Levita Rose, a Nevermore deputy who moonlighted as the graveyard shift's security guard. She was a 30-year-old black woman who Clyde respected. She had grown up on the streets of Chicago before moving to Nevermore. She'd seen how monstrous humans could be toward each other, but instead of letting any of that jade her, she had chosen to keep an optimistic worldview. She knew how to handle herself, but also had a good sense of humor. Clyde hoped she had a flexible mind. After seeing this, she was going to need it or she would end up a patient here. "I'm in Billy's room," Clyde called out. "Those things in the hallway are dead. They won't hurt you. Do you have a taser?" He could hear Levita cautiously making her way down the hallway. You know I keep my taser close, especially since I can't carry my sidearm when I'm on the clock here. Damn, Clyde, these things are ugly as hell. Levita finally made her way to the room and stopped cold when she saw the blood-splattered gnome gnawing away at Billy's face. What, in the name of everything sane and decent, is that thing? Clyde took a cat-quick glance over his shoulder and saw her wide-eyed surprise. It's a gnome. Levita gave a doubtful shake of her head. Doesn't look like any gnome I ever seen. Clyde shuffled the chopstick in his right hand to his left. He then reached out to Levita. You ever seen a real gnome? Levita knew he was reaching for her taser, so she slowly handed it to him. You got me there, she said. Only the pictures and storybooks. Clyde raised the taser and took careful aim at the gnome. Yeah, well, the storybooks lied. The gnome raised up and gave a warning hiss. Clyde pulled the trigger. The barb shot from the taser and stuck deep into the gnome's chest. Clyde shot 50,000 volts into the nasty little creature. It gave a spitting, angry hiss which turned into a pain-filled squeal. Then it rolled off Billy's lifeless body and onto the floor. It lay there completely still. Clyde handed the taser over to Levita, who understood that she was to pull the trigger again should the gnome attempt to move, giving it another 50,000 volts. He walked over and without any hesitation stabbed it in the heart with a chopstick. Levita replaced the spent cartridge with a new one. You killed those two in the hallway with chopsticks? Clyde gave her a grim look and nodded. Yeah, why? Levita gave him an appreciative tilt of her head. That's pretty badass for an old man. Yeah, well, we ain't finished just yet, Clyde said. We have one more. He walked down the hall to Margaret Frank's room. Levita followed, and they both looked into the room through the window and the door. Margaret sat on the floor, her back against the wall. The gnome squatted on her lap, picking pieces of her brain and plopping them in its mouth. Margaret was not yet fully dead, and her body trembled and shook, and her mouth moved as if she were trying to speak, but all that came out was a wet gack, gack, gack. Damn, Levita said. That's nasty. Clyde unlocked the door and stepped inside. He held his chopsticks at the ready as Levita took aim with the taser and pulled the trigger. The gnome stiffened and made a growling hiss. It finally fell across Margaret's chest. Clyde stepped forward and stabbed it through its ear, ensuring that it was dead. He and Levita turned their attention to Margaret, both wondering how to deal with her terrible injury, but she sat staring up at the ceiling with dull, lifeless eyes. She had just died with a small smile on her face, as if she had been in the middle of something that amused her. You sure that's the last one? Levita asked. Clyde nodded. Yeah, they live together by the dozens, but only rare occasions do they hunt with more than 4 to a pack. I feel pretty confident that's all, at least for now. Levita squatted beside Margaret and grimaced at the terrible wound in her head. She then nudged the dead gnome with the barrel of the taser. After a close inspection of the creature, she stood. You say these are gnomes? Yeah, Clyde said. That means you've encountered them before. Clyde nodded. Yeah. Levita paused, in deep thought. Clyde got the sense that she was trying to decide if she wanted to know anything deeper than the idea that these creatures existed. After a moment, she made her decision. Okay, now that I know that they exist, I need to know all you know so that I can help kill them. Clyde explained to her how the gnomes fed off the chemicals that were produced when humans were suffering the effects of psilocybin. He told her of how the gnomes had the ability to present themselves to people who were under the influence as tiny little men with long beards and kind eyes. How did they do that? Levita asked. That is fascinating. Clyde shrugged. There's a lot of lore with a lot of possible explanations, but the best I've gotten, the one that makes the most sense, is that they use black magic. Uh-huh, Levita said, digesting what she'd been told. And who told you that? A couple of folks, Clyde said. The chief of the albino tribe of pygmies down in South America explained it to me. His people have fought these things for 1,000 years. You were in South America with a bunch of pygmies? Clyde nodded. I was their shaman for a year. Shaman? Levita asked. Yeah, I've been following these things since I was a teenager. My research led me to their tribe down in South America, and while I learned everything they knew about gnomes, I returned the favor by teaching them about better hygiene and farming and such. They thought I knew white magic and made me their shaman while I was there. You said there were 2 folks who told you they used magic. Who was the second? Jim Morrison, Clyde said. The singer? Levita said. Yeah, Clyde said. From the Doors? Levita asked, giving him a look of disbelief. Clyde nodded. Yeah, from the Doors. And I'm surprised a woman of your age knows anything about that kind of music. I know good music when I hear it, Levita said. But how did he teach you? I mean, Jim Morrison is dead. He wasn't always dead, Clyde replied. Not long after I began hunting gnomes, I was introduced to him, and he taught me what he knew about gnomes and magic. Jim Morrison of the Doors knew about gnomes? Levita asked. I mean, I know it seems weird that I can be open to the idea of gnomes and magic, but struggle that you met Jim and he knew anything about any of this kind of stuff. Clyde shrugged. I get it. It's a lot to digest. But I'll ask you this. Have you ever paid attention to any of Jim Morrison's lyrics? The day destroys the night divides the day, try to run, try to hide, break on through to the other side? Levita tilted her head as she considered the lyrics Clyde had just quoted. Well, I'll be damned. I can see how it would seem he's talking about good and evil and dark magic. And I'd challenge you to think deeper on what he was saying in People Are Strange, Clyde said. He knew about the spiritual realm, and that's how he communicated it. My mind is utterly and completely blown, Levita said. What do we do now? I usually haul off the dead gnomes, Clyde said. Then I make an anonymous phone call to the police, and I let them handle any explanations of why the victims are chewed up. They usually say it was some kind of animal attack. Well, this situation's going to be harder to explain, Levita said. I mean, we basically have 2 dead inmates inside a secure sanitarium. Clyde had been thinking through that particular problem. I'm open for suggestions. Well, I've lived here in Nevermore for a couple of years now, Levita said. Strange things happen here that most folks refuse to talk about. As a deputy, I've heard rumors that Sheriff Mosley is open to the idea of the paranormal. You think he can be trusted? Clyde asked. Levita nodded. I do. He's a good man. Let's secure this hallway and stop anyone else from entering this wing. I'll call the sheriff, and when he gets here, he'll know what to do. And I think it would be a good idea for you to tell him all you know about these things. Clyde felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. He had been fighting gnomes his whole life, mostly in secret and almost always by himself. He'd told a few people here and there who thought he was off his rocker. But he knew without a doubt that Levita would have his back. And the idea that Sheriff Mosley could be trusted as an ally as well made him feel as if he might finally have help carrying this burden. All right, he said. Call him. Being a deputy who moonlighted as a guard, Levita had Mosley's number. She called and gave a quick explanation. When she hung up, she said, He's on his way. Now, is there anything else going on around here I need to know about? Yeah, Clyde said. I think Nurse Barbara is a vampire.